Hello, welcome. I'm Paul Corrigan, and I'm here with Andre Henry to discuss James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Andre is a friend, a minister, a musician, an artist, a theologian contending for the world that ought to be, as you put on your Facebook bio, and an activist in the movement for Black Lives. And you can find him online at andrerhenry.com. And the book, The Fire Next Time, is one of the most acclaimed texts in African American writing, a work of social commentary on many things, including race and racism, and a book that many people, including us, find extraordinarily relevant to the present. If you want a copy, you can find it wherever books are sold. And if you cannot afford a copy, let's talk, because I want you to have one if you want to have one. Andre, welcome. Thank you for talking about this book with me.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
Is there anything else I should say in introducing you or the book?
No, I think that was a really generous introduction. Thank you.
Well, I guess as a whole, what is this book to you, The Fire Next Time?
Yeah, this book is, I don't know how to summarize, what it is, but it's honest, it's candid, and I think that writing in that letter format allows him to do that because it's this conversation among two people that know intimately the experience that Baldwin is talking about. And because he's speaking to someone in that same group, he can be candid and about the experience that he has had, the experience that his nephew is having. Yeah, I think that's probably how I'd answer that question.
So this book was written 55 years ago. How does it speak to your life as a Black man in the 21st century, 5.5 decades later?
Yeah, you know what is interesting about reading this particular text in our time, in our moment in history, is how relevant it still is. Like there were several quotes that I wrote down or that I typed into an email and sent to myself because, I felt like Baldwin was my uncle, talking to me about some of the things that we're seeing and experiencing now. Although, I mean, last year I could have said we're not seeing like really overt forms of racism just marching the streets, but that's no longer true. There's still a lot of those obstacles in society, a lot of those challenges that we see today. And I like how Baldwin is so, I said candid already, but there's almost a defiant tone to the way that he speaks about that. There's not a lot of mincing words in the text to me. Although sometimes he is really clever about the way that he criticizes racism in American society, and sometimes he does it in a way that is sarcastic and funny. I still think that one thing that I'm thinking of in particular is that quote where he says, I decided that I would die and go to hell before I let a white man spit on me, and I think that kind of boldness or defiant tone to talk about it is something that's really encouraging for me in my place today, because I grew up in a context where, and even still now, where people would rather you just not talk about experiencing racial injustice at all. And to speak that way, even about the social pain of that reality, is offensive to some people. And so it's really easy to not do that. So to see Baldwin just stating it like it is really inspiring.
Can you share with us some passages that stood out to you, that have stuck with you, and talk to us about this?
Yeah, I will just need to pull up another window because I have some in my email. One in particular is about his time as a minister. And I guess that he was telling us the story of how he left the ministry. And I have it right here, but the passage spoke to me so deeply because I started leading worship in church when I was 12. I went to Bible college with you. And then I moved to New York City, where I was on staff at a church for 7 years and just graduated from seminary last year. So, I've spent my life around the ministry and around the church. And it has been really frustrating to see how the Christian faith can really be an obstacle to pursuing racial justice, sometimes intentionally so. So I remember reading this passage that I'm about to read and thinking, oh my gosh, I could have written this. Only not as artistically and poetically, but but the sentiment, the content of it felt like something that I would have written down in a journal. So he says, therefore, when I faced a congregation, it began to take all the strength I had not to stammer, not to curse, not to tell them to throw away their Bibles and get off their knees and go home and organize, for example, a rent strike. When I watched all the children, their copper, brown, and beige faces staring up at me as I taught Sunday school, I felt that I was committing a crime in telling them about the gentle Jesus and telling them to reconcile themselves to their misery on earth in order to gain the crown of eternal life. Were only Negroes to gain this crown? Was heaven then to be merely another ghetto?
Ouch.
Yeah. Yeah, that sentiment that where he asked, were only Negroes to gain this crown is something that I think about a lot, in the sense that when I talk about my experience as a Black man who has decided to talk about racial justice, a lot of Christians have a lot of scriptures and they don't think that they're trying to silence me. They're just asking questions about how do you reconcile some of the things that Jesus says with speaking about leaving the church, and refusing to talk with certain white people who want to deny racism and minimize your experience, which I do. I have white family that I don't talk to anymore because they didn't want to acknowledge, that my experience as a Black man is not the same as theirs as white people. And that just for my mental health, I couldn't continue that relationship. It felt unhealthy. And so you have people who are like, well, what about Jesus saying to pray for your enemies? Or what about Jesus, saying this or that? And at times it feels like the entire burden of being a Christian is on Black people. Those expectations summon Black people to kind of be Christ figures for their white counterparts. So when Baldwin says all of this, I'm like, yes, 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 amen.
What he says, what kind of the last straw that helped him, that pushed him out of the church, was he said there's just no love in the church. He said we were taught we were supposed to love everybody, and then it didn't seem like it actually counted. It seems to go kind of hand in hand with this, right? This disconnect between here's the gospel we say, and the gospel we live. You live this part, and I'll live the.
Yeah, I'll do the slapping and you turn the other cheek.
Ooh.
Because how will you ever be able to fulfill this scripture if no one does violence against you? So I'll do the violence part, and you You can do the suffering servant, slaughtered lamb, cheek turner part.
Or I'll look the other way while somebody else does the violence if I'm not.
Yeah.
So Baldwin was a minister, and then he talks a lot about kind of how and why he left. But I think this book is still, I mean, can be read in a very positive, affirming way for believers, as in here's how you could live your faith.
Yeah.
You don't have to have a hypocritical faith.
Right.
It doesn't, something you say all the time, I think of, it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have another passage for us?
Sure. I closed that window too soon, apparently. There are some things that he just says to his nephew about understanding the world that they're in, and understanding and interpret and not internalizing the treatment that they're receiving, that were also really spoke to me. So where is it? Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity. Is one that stands out to me. And I think that for me, it was hard to name the fact that when we talk about racism then or today, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about human rights abuses, right? And it seems dramatic. It seems like a grandiose thing to say. Inhumanity is a huge word. As far as the weight of it, right? Nobody thinks that what they do is evil, especially if their evil is inactivity. Evil is just a really heavy word. Inhumanity is a heavy word. We think we do something bad, or maybe messed up, or maybe unwise or unhealthy, or
but inhuman. Inhumane.
And so I really appreciated, again, like this candor. Oh, this is another one that I really loved. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto where in fact it intended that you should perish. He keeps mentioning innocence.
Yeah.
In the book, and that's that sarcasm that is in there throughout, because I think that when we talk about racism then, as it is today, that there were a lot of people who probably couldn't imagine themselves going out and lynching a person in the 50s and 60s. There are a lot of white people that probably wouldn't have gone out and punched a black person in the face, even though there was enough that would have. There were still many that were not actively opposed to integration or racial justice. And none of them owned slaves, right? None of them owned plantations. The same way that people today can say, well, I didn't own slaves, and all that kind of thing. So that idea of innocence is there. And I love how he addresses it. It was helpful to see that it's been there for a while too. That idea is not new. Where when we talk about privilege and injustice and equality, a lot of people, want to say, well, I'm innocent of that. I appreciate seeing that idea, that sentiment has a genealogy. It has a history. It's been around for a while.
I like what he says. Just exactly what you're talking about. He says it's not permissible that the authors of destruction should also be innocent.
Mm-hmm.
It is the innocence which constitutes the crime.
Yeah. I have that one highlighted as well.
You don't know, and you don't want to know.
Right.
Is this kind of innocence that he's talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And that kind of ignorance, you know, not said as an epithet, but just literally not knowing, is intentional. It's cultivated, you know, which means that you're not that ignorant because you at least know enough to know that you don't want to go too deeply into the subject matter, you know. So it means that you know that something is behind the door, and you know that whatever's behind the door is not good. But you think
Right.
as long as you don't know the details, that you can continue to say, well, you know, I don't know. You can absolve yourself. And I think that we see that a lot now with, you know, when you're a Black person and you decide that you want to talk about racial justice, and which means that you have to talk about racial injustice. You know, you have people that jump into the conversation when it's convenient for them to do so. And, you know, they oppose, they deflect, they deny. But then if you begin to ask those same people, have you, you know, have you read Michelle Alexander? Have you read Bryan Stevenson? Have you read Dr. King? You know, not that I have a dream speech, but have you read anything else by Dr. King? Have you read Baldwin? A lot of times those answers are no, you know? And so there is this desire to kind of keep the conversation at a level of ignorance, you know? And I can't read anyone's mind, so I can't say why people want to stay there, you know? But I can say that there are these notions of innocence that go along with it, because as long as you don't really, once you start knowing the details about our criminal justice system, education, housing, all that kind of stuff, once you know the details, there's just no way to continue to deny what's going on. It just becomes really clear.
Thank you. In about the middle of the book, you know, he talks about a lot of things in this book. He talks about religion. He talks about his family. He talks about love. He talks a lot about race and racism. And then he has this passage that at first seems a little odd. He starts talking about bread, and like it seems, even though it may be initially out of place in the book, it seems important. Like he's making an important a point here. So he says, bottom of 42 and then the top of 43. The word sensual is not intended in the usual sense. He says to be sensual is, I think, to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the breaking of bread. And then this is where he goes on a little tangent. It will be a great day for America, incidentally, when we begin to eat bread again, instead of the blasphemous and tasteless foam rubber that we have substituted for it. So it's a kind of a humorous comment and out of place, but this idea of just kind of being really present and eating good food as part of the bigger picture here. I think. Well, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this passage?
Yeah, I think when I hear that foam rubber replacement thing, I think of the communion wafers that I grew up with.
Yes.
You know, like we had communion with this little plastic cup with a drop of grape juice in it and a little foam wafer. You know, and so I think of, so I can taste the difference when I talk about it, right? I can feel that tactile difference. And it makes me think of how we've taken like the yeast, the fullness, the, you know, the meat in a sense, you know, out of this experience of of the faith, you know, like this central, what do you call it? Ordinance, right? One of these central ordinances of the faith. And I know that he's not talking about Christianity in that moment, but coming from a theologian's perspective, for me, like that aversion that so many evangelicals have to sensuality is a part of the problem. It's part of what fuels racism and all kinds of other injustices, because we have this idea that separates us from the goodness of our materiality and our material world, right? Like,
including our bodies.
Yeah, exactly. And from all bodies, right?
As people, all bodies.
When we talk about the world in popular, you know, conservative evangelical thought, you know, in the way of Assemblies of God or Foursquare or, you know, these kinds of denominations, there's largely this huge desire to just go to heaven and to be separate from this world. This world is fallen, it's bad. And our bodies kind of are lumped into that category because we imagine heaven being like this disembodied spiritual bliss, right? And so to me, that's, again, it's like taking a loaf of bread that's like thick like this and just hollowing it out, you know, and eating the skin, right? But I think that also it animates the failure for us to see that this world is a sacred place, and that people, and so it matters what happens here. Like, injustice desecrates God's sacred world, and that people, our bodies, are a part of that world. You know, I think that's one way, that's one place where we can actually say, man, like, those ancient people actually might have happened upon a scientific truth when they had God creating people from the ground, from the dust, because our best science says that the same stuff that's in the universe is the same stuff that our bodies are made up of, right? But then God breathes God's own spirit, God's own essence into that body to animate it for life. And it boggles my mind to see how can people still maintain this distinction between sacred, secular, material bad, spirit good, when God has breathed God's own essence into the body to animate it. So then how are human bodies not sacred? And if we don't see that human bodies are sacred, then when human bodies are being, you know, punched in the face by the police on Facebook Live, when they're shot in front of their girlfriend or 4-year-old daughter, when they are tased, bound, and beaten to death after a mental health crisis, then we can't be outraged. Then, you know, we can't empathize. We can't even empathize with God, you know, borrowing from Heschel's, you know, idea of the prophetic, that God calls the prophets to witness the pathos of God. We can't even be grieved with God over the breaking of these sacred bodies, you know, if we don't get it right from the start that sensuality, materiality are divine gifts, you know.
For God so loved the world.
Exactly.
Not just the spirit that will, or the souls that will leave. I think also this passage, one of the things that I really love, I think maybe sometimes people think the whole conversation about justice and racial justice and racial injustice is like, there's bad things happening, shame on you, feel guilty, that like the whole thing is negative, and we need to talk about injustices, but I think here Baldwin says, like, you're missing the point. The point is there's this richness that we could have. We're not living fully. We're not able to live fully.
Yeah.
But we could.
Right.
I have one more passage I want to ask you about here towards the end of the book. He talks about certain Black people who are from white people's perspective. Bottom of 85 here, by causing commotion or not staying in their place. That's the language he uses. By doing this, they are barring yet another door to the country's spiritual and social ease. And then he says, this is probably, hard and odd as it may sound, this barring the door to spiritual and social ease, is probably the most important thing that one human being can do for another. It is certainly one of the most important things. Hence the torments and necessity of love. I wonder if you tell me what you think about this passage, this idea of barring the door to ease, and that this being a hard kind of love.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that we have this idea of love in our culture that is basically niceness. You know, things like I make you feel good, you make me feel good. That's love. You know, but there can't really be love without truth. If you can't tell someone how they are hurting you, or how their actions don't feel loving to you, then there can't really be love between the two of you. Because someone who loves you wants to know that. You know, they want to hear that. Now, I think that I've been thinking about this lately, that everything that I know about social justice begins in these interpersonal relationships. Like the same principles apply. You know? So we can say that about two people in a relationship. We can say that about communities in relationship with one another. You know, I love that Cornel West quote about justice that talks about how justice is what love looks like in public. You know, so when we talk about justice, we are talking about love, but we're not talking about affection. We're talking about the way that we treat one another, right? And so white people in general can't love people of color if they don't care about their rights, the rights of people of color, if they don't care about the suffering of people of color, if they don't care to hear it, then that's not love. On the other side too, and this is where maybe I can see how philosophically, like, you can say it is a loving thing to confront people for the sins that they commit in groups, right? Like if we say, you know, of many white people, well, you're going to be stuck in this cycle of participating in this system that disproportionately affects Black and brown people. You're going to have no choice but to participate in this system if we don't say something, right? And so there's a way to frame that as, it's loving for me to say this to you, because unless you hear and do something, there's no way that you can be free from that, right? At the same time, I think that that may be really idealistic, and that I'm less driven to talk about racial justice. I'm less driven to talk about that because of wanting white people to be free from their racism, as much as I don't want to be a victim of that racism, you know. And I don't know if one is better than the other, and they both can exist. But I went down that path because I was thinking about saying how it's a loving thing to do to tell someone the truth, because they, you know, you're giving them the option to do otherwise. But I think in this context, that's probably not the highest or most salient motivation.
I think Baldwin, you know, does both.
Yeah.
he says, I think at one point, black people just don't want to be beat over their heads every single day of their lives.
Yeah.
They don't care to be loved by you. and yet he really does. He always comes back to this love, and he says to his nephew, the end of his letter to his nephew, and I know that this country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon. Free until they are free.
Yeah.
And so I mean, he's got both the things that you're struggling with. It's just leave me alone. And at the end of the day, we are all in this together, and our freedom is bound up together.
Right. Yeah, agreed. I definitely see the latter. That our freedom is connected. I wonder if when he says that, though, when he says we cannot be free until they are free, do you hear that as being how do you see that connected to love?
Well, he's on the same page. He says, we with love shall force our brothers, our white brothers and sisters, to see themselves as they are.
Yeah.
To cease fleeing from reality and begin to change.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm making this connection.
That makes sense.
This idea, and he says on a kind of a page or two before that, you must accept them, white people, and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope. So I guess I'm as a white man, I'm really grateful for him saying that, and maybe that's self-serving. So I read the whole book, right? I'm not just going to pick out like folks do with MLK so often, the past on love. I'm going to read the whole book, but I do really appreciate how he comes back to love again and again.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other things that you might say about the book, or about James Baldwin, or about anything? I mean, while we're talking.
I don't have anything in mind at the moment. Other than I do think that I wish that more people knew about Baldwin. I think that even Black people that I've spoken to, I've asked, have you read James Baldwin? And they say, who? And so I think that this is an important voice, not just because of his participation in the civil rights movement, but because what he had to say is still so relevant. I wish that we heard more of him and voices like his alongside Dr. King's, and I wish that we heard Dr. King's voice actually for what he actually had to say too. But we're truncating these voices that still have so much to offer us.
Amen. Thank you so much. I really appreciate taking the time to talk with me about this.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate the invitation.
Godspeed.
All right, brother.